Section 16 of Gray's Anatomy, Part 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anne Boulay. Anatomy of the Human Body, Part 5, by Henry Gray. The Abdomen, Part 1. The abdomen is the largest cavity in the body. It is of an oval shape, the extremities of the oval being directed upward and downward. The upper extremity is formed by the diaphragm, which extends as a dome over the abdomen, so that the cavity extends high into the bony thorax, reaching on the right side, in the mammary line, to the upper border of the fifth rib. On the left side, it falls below this level by 2.5 centimeters. The lower extremity is formed by the structures which clothe the inner surface of the bony pelvis, principally the levator ani and the coccygeus on either side. These muscles are sometimes termed the diaphragm of the pelvis. The cavity is wider above than below, and measures more in the vertical than in the transverse diameter. In order to facilitate description, it is artificially divided into two parts: an upper and larger part, the abdomen proper, and the lower and smaller part, the pelvis. These two cavities are not separated from each other, but the limit between them is marked by the superior aperture of the lesser pelvis. The abdomen proper differs from the other great cavities of the body in being bounded for the most part by muscles and fascia, so that it can vary in capacity and shape according to the condition of the viscera which it contains. But, in addition to this, the abdomen varies in form and extent with age and sex. In the adult male, with moderate distension of the viscera, it is oval in shape, but at the same time flattened from before backward. In the adult female, with a fully developed pelvis, it is ovoid with the narrower pole upward, and in young children it is also ovoid, but with the narrower pole downward. Boundaries. It is bounded in front and at the sides by the abdominal muscles and the iliacus muscles, behind by the vertebral column and the psoas and quadratus lumborum muscles, above by the diaphragm, below by the plane of the superior aperture of the lesser pelvis. The muscles forming the boundaries of the cavity are lined upon their inner surfaces by a layer of fascia. The abdomen contains the greater part of the digestive tube. Some of the accessory organs to digestion, viz., the liver and pancreas, the spleen, the kidneys, and the suprarenal glands. Most of these structures, as well as the wall of the cavity in which they are contained, are more or less covered by an extensive and complicated serous membrane, the peritoneum. The apertures in the walls of the abdomen. The apertures in the walls of the abdomen, for the transmission of structures to and from it, are in front, the umbilical in the fetus, for the transmission of the umbilical vessels, the allantois and vitelline duct; above, the vena caval opening, for transmission of the inferior vena cava, the aortic hiatus, for the passage of the aorta, azygos vein, and thoracic duct, and the esophageal hiatus, for the esophagus and vagi. Below, there are two apertures on either side, one for the passage of the femoral vessels and the lumboinguinal nerve, and the other for the transmission of the spermatic cord in the male and the round ligament of the uterus in the female. Regions. For convenience of description of the viscera, as well as of reference to the morbid conditions of the contained parts, the abdomen is artificially divided into 9 regions by imaginary planes, 2 horizontal and 2 sagittal, passing through the cavity, the edges of the planes being indicated by lines drawn on the surface of the body. Of the horizontal planes, the upper or transpyloric is indicated by a line encircling the body at the level of a point midway between the jugular notch and the symphysis pubis; the lower by a line carried around the trunk at the level of a point midway between the transpyloric and the symphysis pubis. The latter is practically the intertubular plane of Cunningham, who pointed out that its level corresponds with the prominent and easily defined tubercle on the iliac crest about 5 cm behind the anterior superior iliac spine. By means of these imaginary planes the abdomen is divided into 3 zones, which are named from above downward, the subcostal, the umbilical, and hypogastric zones. Each of these is further subdivided into 3 regions by the 2 sagittal planes, which are indicated on the surface by lines drawn vertically through points halfway between the anterior superior iliac spines and the symphysis pubis. The middle region of the upper zone is called the epigastric, and the 2 lateral regions, the right and left hypochondriac. The central region of the middle zone is the umbilical, and the 2 lateral regions, the right and left lumbar. The middle region of the lower zone is the hypogastric or pubic region, and the lateral regions are the right and left iliac or inguinal. The pelvis is the portion of the abdominal cavity which lies below and behind a plane passing through the promontory of the sacrum, lineae terminalis of the hip bones, and the pubic crests. It is bounded behind by the sacrum, cocci, piriformis, and the sacrospinous and sacrotuberous ligaments, in front and laterally by the pubis and ischia and obturatores internii. Above, it communicates with the abdomen proper. Below, it is closed by the levatorus ani and the coccygeae and the urogenital diaphragm. The pelvis contains the urinary bladder, the sigmoid colon and rectum, a few coils of the small intestine, and some of the generative organs. When the anterior abdominal wall is removed, the viscera are partly exposed as follows. Above and to the right side is the liver, situated chiefly under the shelter of the right ribs and their cartilages, but extending across the middle line and reaching for some distance below the level of the xiphoid process. To the left of the liver is the stomach, from the lower border of which an apron-like fold of the peritoneum, the greater omentum, descends for a varying distance, and obscures, to a greater or lesser extent, the other viscera. Below it, however, some of the coils of the small intestine can generally be seen, while in the right and left iliac regions respectively, the cecum and the iliac colon are partly exposed. The bladder occupies the anterior part of the pelvis, and if distended, will project above the symphysis pubis. The rectum lies in the concavity of the sacrum, but is usually obscured by the coils of the small intestine. The sigmoid colon lies between the rectum and the bladder. When the stomach is followed from left to right, it is seen to be continuous with the first part of the small intestine, or duodenum, the point of continuity being marked by a thickened ring which indicates the position of the pyloric valve. The duodenum passes toward the undersurface of the liver, and then, curving downward, is lost to sight. If, however, the greater omentum be thrown upward over the chest, the inferior part of the duodenum will be observed passing across the vertebral column towards the left side, where it becomes continuous with the coils of the jejunum and ileum. These measure some 6 meters in length, and if followed downward, the ileum will be seen to end in the right iliac fossa by opening into the cecum, the commencement of the large intestine. From the cecum the large intestine takes an arched course, passing at first upward on the right side, then across the middle line, and downward on the left side, and forming respectively the ascending, transverse, and descending parts of the colon. In the pelvis it assumes the form of a loop, the sigmoid colon, and ends in the rectum. The spleen lies behind the stomach in the left hypochondriac region, and may be in part exposed by pulling the stomach over toward the right side. The glistening appearance of the deep surface of the abdominal wall and of the surface of the exposed viscera is due to the fact that the former is lined, and the latter are more or less completely covered, by a serous membrane, the peritoneum. The peritoneum, tunica serosa. The peritoneum is the largest serous membrane in the body, and consists, in the male, of a closed sac, part of which is applied against the abdominal parietes, while the remainder is reflected over the contained viscera. In the female, the peritoneum is not a closed sac, since the free ends of the uterine tubes open directly into the peritoneal cavity. The part which lines the parietes is named the parietal portion of the peritoneum. That which is reflected over the contained viscera constitutes the visceral portion of the peritoneum. The free surface of the membrane is smooth, covered by a layer of fattened mesothelium, and lubricated by a small quantity of serous fluid. Hence the viscera can slide freely against the wall of the cavity or upon one another with the least possible amount of friction. The attached surface is rough,